Hi, welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be going back and we're going to be talking about the 27th President of the United States and the 10th Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, one William Howard Taft. And Chris, I must confess to you that Taft is one of my more favorite personalities when it comes to the presidency. He is a fascinating figure.
Yeah, and I think what makes him so fascinating is the relationships that he had with people. And, he was once best friends with Theodore Roosevelt, and then he was bitter enemies with Theodore Roosevelt. But he's just this large man in physical stature, but also just in history. And there's so much about William Howard Taft. I don't know how we fit it all into one podcast because this guy was absolutely amazing, funny, devoted, caring. And at the end of the day, he probably has done more in the public service sector of the United States of America than many individuals that we discuss on this podcast and really in history books.
Yeah, every once in a while you hear someone say of a modern politician that this person's the most qualified to be in a particular job. But when you look at the resume that William Howard Taft brought to the presidency, but then brought to the Supreme Court, I mean, this is a man who had done a lot for the United States and somebody who had the qualifications to be in any job he wanted to be in. So let's get looking at William Howard Taft. Taft, of course, is born in 1857, just prior to the outbreak of the American Civil War. He attends Yale University, from which he graduates. He earns a law degree. He moves to Cincinnati, Ohio, where he works his way up. I mean, he is, at the end of the day, Chris, when we think about William Howard Taft, people may think about him as the president who got stuck in a bathtub, which we'll talk about later. But, this is a man who was a judge. This is a man who had a sharp legal mind and who had worked his way up throughout the legal profession. Now, he was involved in the Republican Party. At this point, of course, that is the party of Abraham Lincoln. He's involved in that particular party, and he moves up through the judiciary there. And Chris, it's ironic that this is a man who's going to become president because he didn't like politics. He liked being a judge.
Yeah, he was all about the law. And, I think it's interesting, you mentioned he went to Yale, and we don't think much about Yale as far as anything but scholarly, right? But William Howard Taft was actually the heavyweight wrestling champion at Yale. And, I think we need to give our listeners, because he's the one, you mentioned the bathtub, and, this was a big dude back in the day. I mean, he was, about 6'1". And when he was at Yale, I think his wrestling weight was like 243 pounds. But as he kind of moved along and got into politics and even into the presidency, his weight actually got up to as high as 330 some pounds. Back at the time of his death, he will come back down to about 250 pounds or so. But, he was this guy that he was tall, he was round, he had this ruddy complexion. He had a blonde mustache and dark hair. And some people say that his legs were short compared to his torso. I mean, he is this impressive stature of a man. And yet he's got this charm about him in so many different ways. And, you're absolutely right. Politics isn't his thing. He's forced into it.
Mm-hmm.
His thing is the law. If he could have just stayed doing the law over and over and over, he would have. But in every single thing that happens, and of course he's forced into the presidency, and that comes a little bit later, but he's even forced out of law to go and be the governor, if you will, of the Philippine Islands. And I think if you go back and look at that, it was McKinley, right? Wasn't it McKinley that did that? And I think the reason that Taft decided to leave the law practice and go do this is because McKinley had actually said, hey, if you go do this for me, then quid pro quo, I'll nominate you for a seat on the highest court of the land, the Supreme Court. You know, if you take care of this. The problem is McKinley doesn't last to be able to fulfill that wish because he's assassinated.
Yeah, and Roosevelt, I believe, actually did offer to nominate him to the court, and he turned it down.
Why did he turn it down? Do you remember why?
I don't remember. I think it was he was busy in the Philippines and didn't want to leave that job.
Yeah, no, that's the exact thing. He basically even said, my job's not done. I've got to finish this. I mean, he had that much of a heart for the Philippines. And I just think that was really interesting because if you think about it, he wasn't really intentional about wanting to do it. I think he had something different, in mind, of course, staying in law and doing the Supreme Court, but he went to rule a conquered nation, in the Philippines. But while he was there, he fell in love with the Philippines, and the people fell in love with him. I remember reading something like when he left, that all the people said, "We want Taft. Don't leave. We want Taft." That they really loved him, and he loved them, which is why he turned Roosevelt down. But can you imagine that? You're given what you want.
I mean, this is a man who that was his dream job. I mean, it would be, the equivalent of walking up to a person and saying, all right, what profession would you like to be in for the rest of your life? And they say, okay, here it is. And then the person turning it down. I mean, he really, being on the Supreme Court was a lifelong ambition for Taft. And of course, when you think about it, that's not, for most people, that wouldn't be a realistic goal in life. I mean, today, I don't remember off the top of my head how many Supreme Court justices there were in the early 20th century, but today there are 9. 9 out of 330 plus million Americans are on the Supreme Court. So it's not something that, is a very achievable goal for most people. We talk about the Philippines, and I was going to mention the Philippines because how did Taft get to the Philippines? That may be a question that some of our listeners are asking. If our listeners are not familiar with the situation, there was an uprising in Cuba. The Spanish government dominated Cuba, and there was a rebellion movement, an independence movement within Cuba. And President William McKinley, sent the USS Maine to Cuba to basically monitor things and to see what was going on. And of course, there were a lot of Americans who were pushing McKinley to get involved in Cuba, but he didn't really want to. But he did send the USS Maine down to Cuba. And then on February 15, 1898, the USS Maine explodes. And of course, the media goes right to that this was a military act, that the ship had been targeted. And the media starts immediately on, the slogans, the propaganda, the remember the Maine to hell with Spain and things like that. And so the United States gets pulled in at this point to what we call the Spanish-American War, which was a very short war. But that's how, and of course the Philippines got dragged into it. And that's basically how William Howard Taft ends up in the Philippines under President William McKinley, who, of course, is going to be shot and killed, I believe, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, in 1901 at the World's Fair.
Yes.
Yeah, and so he's going to continue serving there in the Philippines under President Theodore Roosevelt. While he's in the Philippines, he works to improve the economy of the Philippine Islands, build roads, build schools, and work to give people some participation in their government. He does come back to the United States, however, in 1907, when his friend at this point, President Theodore Roosevelt, offers him the position of Secretary of War. So that's ultimately what brings him back to the United States. And now he is out of the judiciary. He goes to the Philippines as a governor there. He comes back as Secretary of War. Basically today that would be Defense Secretary. He comes back as Secretary of War. So now, Chris, he's out of the legal field, and now he's in the political field.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to know that he had to be persuaded to leave the Philippines once again. It wasn't, I mean, he turned down the Supreme Court job, but, you know, Roosevelt still had to persuade him. And the only reason he took the Secretary of War position is because the Secretary of War still had jurisdiction over the islands. And so he would still have control. He would still be managing and making sure that the Philippines were being respected, because he gets into a serious issue. And I know we're talking a lot about the Philippines, but he gets into a serious issue with General Douglas MacArthur, who's the Army general over there in the Philippines. And, you know, MacArthur cares nothing for the Philippines, the what do you call them? Filipinos. He, you know, MacArthur doesn't care for them. He just cares. He sees it as territory. That's all he sees it as. Whereas Taft cares for the people. And so what happens is there's this argument between MacArthur and also Taft. You know, MacArthur basically says, why are you going to rule the Philippines with democracy? You need to rule it by a bayonet. And Taft is just like, no, we're not going to do that. And MacArthur's soldiers begin singing a song, and the song that they sing ended like this. It said, quote, "He may be a brother of William H. Taft, but he ain't no friend of mine." And so there starts Taft, this really gargantuan of a man, stood up to General Douglas MacArthur, who many people didn't stand up to, and was a character in itself. But you're right. So after that, Roosevelt pulls him out. And not only does he become Secretary of War, but honestly, Ray, he becomes like assistant president. I mean, they're best friends. I mean, Roosevelt and Taft are best friends. And, you know, what happens is Roosevelt pretty much gives him all responsibilities. He's like the president's troubleshooter. Whenever there's a crisis, there's William Taft who's out there doing it, trying to put out a fire. He's trying to solve the latest crisis. He's trying to bring peace to whatever it is that's going on. And so Roosevelt comes to respect that. He appreciates that. And then Roosevelt does that one thing that is bound to the story of friendship. And that is, he paves the way for Taft to become president after him.
Yeah, Theodore Roosevelt, of course, was vice president under William McKinley. And when William McKinley was shot and killed in 1901, Theodore Roosevelt, to the horror of many conservative Republicans, became president of the United States. And you mentioned a minute ago, Chris, you said that William Howard Taft was sort of like the assistant president under Roosevelt. Do you know who the vice president was for Theodore Roosevelt in his second term? He didn't have, when Roosevelt became president in 1901, he never appointed a vice president. And I had to look this up. His vice president in his second term was a guy called Charles Warren Fairbanks. You know, I mean, yeah, really. Taft came out much better in this deal than Fairbanks did.
Yeah, because I bet our listeners are like us and they're like, who?
Who? I mean, even I didn't know that one. That one caught me. But Roosevelt, of course, he serves from 1901 until 1904 when he's reelected. He reinaugurated in 1905. When it came to the presidential election of 1908, Roosevelt decided, I'm not running for a third term, essentially. I'm stepping aside. And he endorsed his Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, to be the Republican nominee in the election of 1908, which, with the popularity of Teddy Roosevelt in many circles of the Republican Party, again, there were circles that were not happy with him, but Taft gets the nomination in 1908. And he's running against a number of individuals, Eugene Debs, who's a socialist, Eugene Chaffin, who's a prohibitionist. But the one candidate that Taft runs against the Democrat candidate is a guy called William Jennings Bryan. Now, Bryan is going to be this character. He's a character I find very fascinating. Maybe we need to do a podcast episode on Bryan at one point, because this man runs for president several times and actually gains the nomination. So he's running against William Howard Taft, Republican Taft versus Democrat William Jennings Bryan. At the end of the election, Taft wins comfortably in the Electoral College with 321 electoral votes to 162 electoral votes. He defeats Bryan by about 1 million votes in the popular vote as well. So William Howard Taft in 1909 is inaugurated as President of the United States, a position, Chris, he didn't want.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Not only was it Roosevelt that persuaded Taft to run for president, but it's his wife who probably has the most persuasion. It's very evident that his wife wore the pants in this family. And Miss Taft, who went by Nellie, she was the former Helen Herron, and she was a bright, attractive girl. But research shows that she had a stubborn mouth. And she didn't make friends easily. And what she wanted is what she wanted. And it's pretty, her ambition is probably higher than Taft's ambition for the Supreme Court. I mean, whereas Taft, all he wanted was to be Chief Justice. All Nellie wanted was to be First Lady in the White House. Her father was a college classmate of former President Benjamin Harrison. Also, her father was the law partner of Rutherford B. Hayes. She was her mother was the daughter and sister of congressmen. And there's an interesting story that states that she was 17 years of age and she was staying with President and Miss Hayes. And Nellie said, they were staying at the White House. And she said, I love the White House so much. I'm going to marry someone who's going to be destined to go to the White House. And she just had that flair and she had that attitude that kind of went about her. And even when he wins the nomination, then he wins the presidency, one of the things that she does is she shatters precedent on Inauguration Day. For an Inauguration Day, basically what's supposed to happen is the new president rides to the White House pretty much by himself. And she said, I am going to be at my husband's side. I want everybody to see me walk into that White House for the first time. I am going to be a part of that White House. And sure enough, she will be. And she loves the parties at the White House. She engages in she's a character in herself.
She's very much a social butterfly. There's a picture of her in March 1909 riding with Taft in the boat on the way to the inauguration.
But just as a side note to end the story on Nellie, the same thing, here she is destined, right, to go to the White House. And she has said it since she was 17 years of age. And the sad thing that happens is 3 months after the inauguration, she has a stroke. And she's not able to really experience all that she had wanted to experience. There is something charming in that President Taft will be the one who provides speech therapy to her and is able to basically get her speaking again, but she'll never be the same. And, I think Taft dies before her, like 13 years earlier, but she's never the same person. And I just think that goes to show we can spend all the years of our life going for something, but it can be taken away from you just as soon as anything. So anyway, pretty sad story.
I think there's a parallel there with Andrew Jackson's wife, Rachel.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think the difference with Andrew Jackson's wife, wouldn't you agree, is she didn't really demand all of that came. Nellie demanded it.
She wanted to be first lady, and of course she died before she had a chance to enjoy that.
But they were so mean to her, and that's a whole nother topic.
So mean. One thing we could talk about, Nellie Taft being one of the main reasons William Howard decided to run for the presidency. There's a quote that I have here in my notes that I did want to throw in here. It's from William Howard Taft, and he said this about the possibility of him running for president. Don't sit up nights thinking about making me the president, for that will never come, and I have no ambition in that direction. And here's what he says here. Any party which would nominate me would make a great mistake. Well, in 1908, the Republican Party made the mistake. I don't think they actually made a mistake, but they, quote, made the mistake of nominating William Howard Taft. And he, like I said earlier, he does win the presidency. And of course, you know, without getting into too much detail, Theodore Roosevelt is going to turn on Taft, you know, viciously by the time the election of 1912 comes along. Roosevelt's going to try to take the nomination away from Taft. But the reality of it is that Taft continued many of Roosevelt's policies, reform policies, but he just simply didn't do it in the way that I think Taft wanted him to do. That Roosevelt wanted him to do. He didn't believe in really the bully pulpit that Roosevelt viewed the presidency as. He once said that, that Roosevelt ought more often to have admitted the legal way of reaching some of the same ends. So he had different views of how to go about some of the things, but many of his ideas were some degree in line with Roosevelt. But of course, he did alienate the liberal Roosevelt wing of the Republican Party when he defended an act that allowed for higher tariffs and a trade agreement with Canada that a lot of those people didn't like. So by the time you come to 1912, he's no longer popular with Roosevelt or with the Roosevelt wing of the Republican Party. But it needs to be said, in case one thinks that Taft abandoned the Roosevelt agenda, he didn't. He initiated during his time in office more than 80 antitrust suits. So he was a trust buster. He just didn't go about it the same way, same high profile, banging the pulpit way that Theodore Roosevelt did.
Yeah. And I think that this is one of those great discussions that need to be had, when you're assessing the legacies of presidents and things like that. These guys were best friends in the broadest sense. They cared about each other. And I think Roosevelt, the whole reason he put Taft in, as you said, was he was going to continue the legacy. And two things I think, based on what you said, could have happened. Number one is that, yes, he did continue the Roosevelt legacy, but he did even more, which kind of affected Roosevelt's ego, which Roosevelt is one of my favorite presidents. And I'll admit he had an ego that was the size of an elephant that he would hunt. He was a very cocky, prideful individual, along with some other things that he had. And so I think as he heard those things, it began to trouble him. But I think the other thing that goes with this is I really think Roosevelt wanted him to do well. So much so that when Taft came into office, Teddy went to Africa. He actually went over to Africa and went big game hunting, so that he could allow Taft to have the spotlight. So they could allow, that he would be gone, and Taft was going to be in place, and that everything was going to be, would be going on. But Roosevelt's only 51 when he leaves the White House. And that's really young. And you start thinking Roosevelt's got a lot of life. And when he comes back after the trip, what starts to happen is his buddies start coming up to him saying, "Oh man, we got some gossip to tell you. Let me know." And so you start to see that it's people, and not necessarily Teddy and William Howard Taft that are causing the issues, but that it's the people that are surrounding them. And we've got to acknowledge William Howard Taft is no Roosevelt. Taft didn't arouse the conscience of the public like Roosevelt did. He didn't have good relationships with the press like Roosevelt did. Oh my gosh, his speeches were.
One thing about Taft when he was president, he became very grumpy.
Well, yeah, he's very grumpy, and his speeches were boring.
Good spiritedness about him.
Yeah, and basically when he thought he had said everything he needed to say, he wouldn't say anything more. And his speeches were legalistic, because that's his style, right? Whereas Teddy, he was just Teddy. He would just tell it like it was. So there's some differences that are there, but it was also interesting to see that there was people who were really struggling with the loyalties between Roosevelt and Taft. One of the maids at the White House said, half the servants here are for Taft, half the servants here are for Teddy. And I just think that plays into what ultimately will become the great breakup between those two. And it's not just any breakup, is it? I mean, they're embodying Taylor Swift. We're never, ever, ever getting back together ever again. I mean, it is just a complete cutting of the cords.
Yeah. And what's going to happen is the election of 1912. Now, this time, of course, they didn't really have the primary system. So the presidential candidates were selected by the party at their conventions. The Democrats selected New Jersey's Woodrow Wilson, who, by the way, while we're talking about Wilson very briefly here, introducing him, he spent time in Wilmington, North Carolina as a child. His father was the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church there in Wilmington, North Carolina. So as a young man, he did spend some time in Wilmington, but Woodrow Wilson would be the Democrat nominee for president. Well, then we come to the Republican convention, and the Republicans, Theodore Roosevelt comes in with the idea of stealing the nomination away from incumbent Republican President William Howard Taft. He fails to do so, and Taft is renominated by the Republican Party. Not one to accept defeat, Roosevelt and his supporters leave the Republican Party, go to the Progressive Party, and he runs his campaign there against both William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson. And at the end of the day, Woodrow Wilson becomes president, a whopping landslide, 435 votes. Roosevelt came in second with 88 votes, nowhere even in the ballpark. And then poor William Howard Taft came in third with 8 electoral college votes. So, I think probably Wilson may have won anyway, whether Roosevelt had jumped in or not, but certainly not a good finish for Taft's presidency, coming in third behind Wilson and Roosevelt.
There was somebody that said the coincidence of 1913 was the fact that at the very moment that Professor Wilson became President Wilson, President Taft will become Professor Taft.
Yes.
I thought that was interesting. Wilson was Princeton, right? Wasn't he Princeton?
Princeton. And then Taft leaves the White House and he becomes a professor of law at his alma mater, Yale. At Yale. I just alienated some of our audience, I'm sure. And later at the end of his life, and we're going to come back and talk about Supreme Court in the bathtub here in a second, but at the end of his life, he's asked about it. He says, I don't even remember I was ever president. I think in many ways, it was the low point of his professional career. He wanted to be Supreme Court. He wanted to be on the Supreme Court, and he got that opportunity.
Yeah, and two things to that. Taft's daughter said that the presidential years, quote, were the only unhappy years of his entire life. That was from Taft's own daughter. The second thing is when he left the presidency and he actually becomes the Kent Chair of Constitutional Law at Yale, it just shows his sense of humor because when they offered the chair of constitutional law, he said that the chair would be inadequate, that he might need to have a sofa of law because he was such a very large guy. And I don't know. I just, there's so much about Taft as president, even though he didn't want to be president, he did a lot of good for being president. Would you say that this, I remember reading this quote, and I wanted to get your opinion on it concerning Taft. Would you say that the only reason that Taft is an average president is because he had the historical misfortune of being sandwiched between Roosevelt and Wilson?
Yeah, Absolutely. I think who a president follows can sometimes impact, how they're viewed. And when you compare him to Teddy Roosevelt, he's outright boring. He doesn't do a good job advertising his accomplishments either.
Yeah, and I mean, as you mentioned, he didn't want to do it, but isn't there something to be said about when you don't want to do something yet you're still called to do it, that you give it everything that you've got?
And I think he did. I think he really dug down and did the best he could as the president, but he did not want to be president. He didn't want the politics. He didn't want the attention, the media attention anyway. He just didn't like any of it. And during his time there in the White House, he was unhappy. By all reports, he gained weight. He became grumpy. I think I already mentioned this. And as soon as he left the White House, he lost weight. He got happy again, which, makes me wonder sometimes, Chris, why did he even run for re-election in 1912 if he was so miserable? Maybe part of it was just not wanting to be run out of town by Roosevelt.
Well, and I also think that, I mean, he was the incumbent, and
Yeah.
I mean, that's embarrassing if you know that you're going to lose and you choose not to lose. I think that was probably a reason that he did that. But I mean, Ray, some of the things that Taft does still affects us today. He was responsible for the constitutional amendments of the direct election of senators.
Yeah.
And he's also the one that is responsible for the income tax. So there you go, Taft. We're thankful for you on that one. Thank you so much. I do find it interesting that one of the big breaking points with Roosevelt, and probably the one thing that really caused issues, is that when Taft came into power, he got rid of Roosevelt's, I guess it was like the Department of Labor, the chief conservation officer, and the Department of Forestry or whatever it was. He fired him. And Roosevelt, of course, is the great conservationist, right?
Yeah.
He's the great leader. And so I think that causes the thing. But once again, Taft had a purpose for that. It wasn't that he was just, getting rid of a guy. He was getting rid of a guy because he had something better in store. So kudos to William Howard Taft. Ray, I think it might be good to even do a second episode on just his rulings with the Supreme Court, because that's such a huge thing. And just kind of ending it here by looking at, here's the guy who didn't want to be president, but did want to be president. And Ray, I cannot let this story go. We got to talk about the bathtub as president.
Yeah. And this is something that comes up very early in his presidency, because when he becomes president, he's a big dude. I think, what did you say, over 300 pounds at this point?
340 is what they seem to think he was.
Somewhere around 340 pounds, which was very, very large for, the early 20th century. This was a very large man for his time. Now, it is true that William Howard Taft, when he became president of the United States, a few months after he's elected in 1908, after the election of 1908, he's supposed to go down to the Panama Canal, the work that's being done there, and inspect that work. Well, the captain of the boat that he's going down there on, it's actually a warship, orders a larger bathtub for Taft while Taft is traveling down there. And a Taft-sized tub, I guess we could say, was built by Manhattan Company, which specialized in these type of things, and built a very large porcelain tub for Taft's journey on the ship. It was more than 7 feet long, 41 inches wide, and it weighed about a ton. And you can find a photograph on Google if you just look it up, and you can see several guys, like 3 guys, sitting in this tub with room to spare. This was a big, 4 guys actually. This was a big bathtub that was ordered for the president-elect at this particular point in time. So he's a big guy, and they do have to add some new tubs in the White House so that he can fit comfortably in these tubs. but also his presidential yacht, a new tub is added to that as well. But the story that he got stuck in a bathtub, Chris, is it historical?
Or, is it one of those things that we just need to wash away and just say, that it's a good story? But what we do know is that they had clawfoot tubs, right? It wasn't like the typical tub that we see today. It was kind of like in the center of a room kind of a thing. But while historical evidence says that he didn't get stuck in the tub, it is evident that they had to make a lot of renovations to the bathroom. Can you imagine a tub that could fit? I've seen that picture, and that picture always amazes my students because it's like the proverbial hot tub, right? That is, we see today where you've got people that are gathering in it. But can you imagine? And I don't know, right? 330 pounds, 6'1", that's an offensive lineman in the NFL today. That's not something that's extraordinarily huge, if you will, but back then they hadn't seen anything like it. And so it was, really, really hard to fathom. But Roosevelt before him wasn't that small of a guy either.
And there is a story, sort of embarrassing for Taft, I'm sure. There is a story a few years later in New Jersey, a place called Cape May, where Roosevelt is upstairs in a hotel. And apparently he's on like maybe the second floor or something, I'm not sure. And there's guests in the area beneath his bathroom. And he takes a bath. Well, when he gets in the tub, the water spills out of the tub, and apparently it dribbles down on the guest below in the room below the tub where he is. So certainly I imagine he will be embarrassed by his weight with incidents like that. And there's actually a quote that I found from what he said the next day. He said, quote, "I'll get a piece of that." When looking out at the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, he says, "I'll get a piece of that fenced in someday. And then when I venture in it, there won't be any overflow." End quote. So he was obviously conscious about his weight, and you got to feel sorry for him. Didn't want to be president, said, had no interest in it, but for a variety of reasons ended up as president, gained weight, had these really ignominious moments where they're having to replace bathtubs on a warship, having to replace bathtubs in the White House. He's dumping water on guests beneath him because he's too big for the tub. You got to feel sorry for the guy who had to go through all that. But as we're going to see in our next episode on William Howard Taft, he enjoys his time as the Supreme Court, so it doesn't end bad for him.
Yeah, I think there's a reawakening. I think there's the second chapter of his life begins. And it's in that chapter where I think that William Howard Taft lives the life that William Howard Taft wanted to live, and not the life that others wanted him to live. And I think in that moment, he does more good for the country than all of the things that he did as president.
Yeah. So we'll come back and we will talk about Taft, the jurist, in a future episode. For now, though, we'll say goodbye and we'll close this episode. Chris, thank you for your help on William Howard Taft. Hope our listeners will share this podcast with their family and friends. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter. You can also find us on Sounder FM and Spotify. If you'd like to contact us with show ideas, you can always contact us at historyyousshouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know @gmail.com. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And we'll talk to you later.